everybody, welcome to my video on soil forming factors and soil properties. The picture in front of you is a very well developed soil profile that developed as rock was altered into soil over thousands of years. And in this video we're going to try to understand some of the factors that control soil formation and also some of the properties of soil. This is really important. The properties of soil allow it to support life and vegetation and thus the human world, and also we build buildings and roads on soils. So those properties are going to control whether those buildings and roads are stable over long time periods. So the first thing to understand about soil is that it has two main ingredients: broken down rock and organic material. Okay? And the definition of a soil is something that is capable of sustaining plant life, something where you can grow a plant. And essentially, soil is made in situ by altering rocks that were already there. We're going to break them down, and we're going to mix in organic material from plants. And as we do those two things, we're going to convert the rock into a soil. So in the previous video, we looked at some of the chemical weathering processes that actually break the rock down. And I want to recap those quickly. Chemical weathering is a process that transforms rock into soil in situ. It proceeds very slowly over time, and the rate of chemical weathering is essentially controlled by the availability of fresh rock, by wetness, and by temperature. And as chemical weathering proceeds, it produces certain products that remain in the soil. Things like soil cations, which will become nutrients for plants, clay minerals, and iron oxides. So if you need a refresher on this, see the previous video. In this video, we're going to look at how these weathering processes act to actually create the soil over time. So we'll start by learning about soil horizons, which actually record the soil forming conditions. Then we'll look at how soil texture, or the particle size of soil, governs gas exchange and water availability. Then we'll look at the 5 environmental factors that control soil formation: climate, organic material, relief, parent material, and topography, and how these factors essentially give us different soils forming in different places. And then we'll close with the idea of a soil chronosequence. We'll look deeper at how soil development is a function of time and how actually we can use the degree of soil development to estimate a soil's age. So soil horizons are layers of soil that have unique properties, and those properties are formed by alteration of the rock over time. So here are the soil horizons: O, A, E, B, and C. And the idea is that at one time, all of this soil looked just like the unweathered parent material. But the weathering reactions and the addition of organics altered these horizons. And I want to stress before we go on, it's tempting to think of these as sedimentary layers, but they're absolutely not sedimentary layers. So these upper two layers, the O and the A horizon, are essentially dominated by organic material that's being mixed in as plants and trees die, and that the remains of those plants and trees gets mixed into the soil by bioturbation. Okay? So the O horizon is just composed essentially of loose leaves and grasses, and it's usually very thin right up on the surface. The A horizon is a layer where organic material has been mixed in more deeply, and the organic material has been partially broken down into a substance called humus, which looks a lot like potting soil here. And these humic substances are incredibly important for a healthy soil. In particular, they provide texture and retain moisture and nutrients for plants. And we'll look more about that in our agricultural soils video. Now below the O and the A horizon are the E and the B horizon. So these two horizons are essentially below the extent of organic material. The organic material only extends as deeply as we can mix it in with roots and bioturbation. Below that, we will sometimes find an E horizon. And the E horizon is where the most intense weathering of the parent material is happening. And essentially, material gets weathered here, and then it gets moved downward into the B horizon by a process called translocation. And we can identify two translocation processes. One is leaching, in which dissolved ions essentially get leached out of minerals. They get temporarily dissolved into water, and the water carries those dissolved ions down. Once that water dries out, ions such as dissolved iron react with air and are precipitated as iron oxides down in the B horizon. The other translocation process is called eluviation, and this is when clay minerals are produced by hydrolysis in the E horizon, and water carries those clay particles down and deposits them in the B horizon, okay? And if you need a review of these two reactions, please see the previous video on weathering. The end result of these processes is that the E horizon becomes depleted and the B horizon becomes enriched, especially in things like clay and oxides that have been translocated and deposited into the B horizon. So bringing this back to a real-life profile, here's an example. We've got the thin O on top with the loose plants. We've got the organic-rich A horizon, which has the broken-down humic substances. This is essentially where organic stuff is mixed in. Below that, we've got the E horizon, which is a depleted layer. And then below that, we've got the B horizon, which is enriched in oxides and clays that have been translocated downward. So this brings us next to soil texture, or particle size, which really helps to control the flow of water and the flow of gas through a soil. The flow of water and gas through a soil are really important for two reasons. One is that they control the rate and style of chemical weathering. If we can't get water down through a soil, we can't accomplish any of the soil forming processes we just talked about. And you'll never have an E or a B horizon if you don't have water flowing through your soil. Likewise, if you don't have water and air in your soil, plants cannot survive. Plant roots require water and gas. And if you don't have any plant roots, you don't have any plants, which means you don't have any organic material. And you can't have an O horizon or an A horizon, okay? So soil texture determines whether water and gas can flow, which determines whether you can develop a soil at all. And we think of soil texture using what's called a ternary diagram. In this case, the ternary diagram shows the percentage of clay, the percentage of silt, and the percentage of sand in a given soil. So up here is a very clay-rich soil, a very silt-rich, and a very sand-rich. You may know that the optimal soil is called a loam. It's essentially 20% clay, 40% silt, and 40% sand. Okay? Right here in the middle, a nice mixture of clay, sand, and silt. And that's an optimal texture because it optimizes the retention and the flow of water and gas through the soil. And we can think of the flow of water and gas in terms of two terms. One is called permeability. That's the ability of water and gas to flow through the soil. The other is called porosity. That is the percent of open space in a soil. And so the porosity really controls the total amount of water and gas you could actually store. Both of these properties, permeability and porosity, are controlled by the number and the size of pore spaces and the connectivity of pores. And so pores, I didn't mention, are actually open spaces between the grains of a soil, okay? So if you have a big sandy soil with large sand grains, these pores are going to be larger, okay? If you have a fine-grained clay soil, these pores are going to be very tiny because the clay particles themselves are very, very tiny. So in essence, the grain size of a soil controls the pore size, and the pore size controls the permeability and the porosity. So an understanding of what pores are allows us to think about how they control water retention in soils. And a great analogy is a big sponge. Think of soil as a big sponge that has both large pores and small pore spaces. If you get that sponge or that soil soaking wet in a rainstorm, let's say, those large pores immediately drain their water. It just flows away by gravity. In contrast, medium-sized pores might stay in the sponge, and you might only be able to get rid of them when you squeeze the sponge, when you wring it out. So those medium-sized pores are perfect for plants. They hold plant-available water that can be accessible by roots. But then you also know that after you wring out a sponge, it's still wet. It's not totally dry. And that's because there's still water trapped in what we would call micropores. And these micropores hold water, but that water is in such tiny spaces that it's never available to plants. It's held so tightly a plant root could never even get into the pore to get at it. And so when we think about the ideal soil in terms of water or gas retention, texture, it's entirely determined by texture. Imagine a sandy soil that's filled only with large pores. Water's going to flow right out of it immediately, much the way sand drains from a beach. Likewise, clay soil is the opposite. It has many tiny, disconnected pores, which actually can hold a lot of water, but that water is so tightly held, it's no good for plant roots. In contrast, a loamy soil, which we saw was a combination of sand, silt, and clay, has a perfect combination of small and large pores, so that it can actually hold a lot of plant-available water. And this is all illustrated by this graph here. This graph shows that it plots the water content versus the pressure required to extract that water from a soil. So you can see that initially, with no pressure, clay has the most water and sand has an intermediate amount. If we apply even a little bit of pressure, just say gravitational pressure, the sand immediately loses 30%, or actually 75% of its water content, whereas almost nothing drains gravitationally out of the clay. But then, if you bring in plant roots, a pressure range appropriate for plant roots, they can drain quite a bit out of the loamy soil, but they still can't actually even drain that much out of clay. And to get the residual water out of a clay, you'd essentially have to apply an incredibly high vacuum pressure. So that just illustrates how these different soils have different water retention properties. Okay, so now we've looked at soils in great detail. Let's step back and think about the environmental factors that actually govern how soils form over time. And we think of 5 environmental factors. These are climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time. And together, these make an acronym, which we call ClORPT. Okay? And we're going to look at each of these individually. Climate is super important. Water is necessary to drive weathering reactions like hydrolysis and also to support plant life, which delivers organics. Without water, there is no soil, period. Temperature is also really important. All of the chemical weathering reactions go faster at high temperature. And of course, plants can't live in freezing cold either. So those are a couple of reasons that climate obviously is very important, especially related to plant life. Organic processes are key. We just talked about how it's the dead vegetation that feeds back into making an A layer for soil. If you don't have any organic processes, plants, you don't have any soil, you don't have an A horizon in your soil, okay? Also, living organisms are included under organic processes, and they act to break down, physically break down, and chemically break down soils. Next, we've got relief, or essentially the slope of the land surface. Notice this photo. We've got a nice flat bottomland, which has a great agricultural soil, and these steep mountain slopes have almost no soil at all. So this relief is important for a couple reasons. First, it determines the residence time of water in soil. If water just quickly runs off this slope, it's not going to linger and be able to drive weathering or be able to help plants live. In contrast, water lingers in this flat soil and does both of those things. Parent material is also important. Keep in mind that soil develops as we break down rock. Some rocks are very easy to break down by weathering. Some rocks are very hard to break down by weathering. Likewise, as we break rock down, one of the weathering products is plant nutrients. And those nutrients can become available and help support plant life, which further promotes soil development. So if you have a parent material that's hard to weather or that doesn't provide any nutrients, you're going to have a very limited soil development. And in this photo, we see that difference. This pinkish rock obviously does not promote soil development as well as some of this neighboring gray rock does. And the final factor, of course, is time, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But before I do, I want to show you a soil map of the United States. Here we've got 10 or 12 different soil types, and they're spread widely across the United States. And these different soil types reflect the differences in the 5 ClORPT factors. We know it's very wet and volcanic in the Pacific Northwest. We know that it's very dry in the desert Southwest. Likewise, we know in these high mountains of the Rockies, it's very cold and kind of alpine conditions, and we get these blue soils. So depending on the conditions in different parts of the United States and the world, we're going to get very different soils. We won't go into this in this class, but you could take a soils class if you're interested. All right, so this brings us to the last soil forming factor, and that is time. And I want to talk about how we can use time to create a soil chronosequence. So if climate, organic material, relief, and parent material are all constant, then the rate of soil development essentially depends only on time, okay? So an example would be in New England, if we have a bunch of soils developing at the same elevation on a glacial outwash, on a glacial outwash surface, you could probably argue that ClORP are constant and the only difference should be time. And so what are some of these indicators of soil age or time? Well, over time, we get thicker and brighter soil horizons, okay? For example, a dark A horizon or a bright red B horizon as more iron oxides accumulate in it. We may develop the presence of an E horizon as material is leached out of that E and it starts to take on this whitish color. And of course, we may develop a B horizon that's going to be enriched in clays and iron oxides and other weathering products. So essentially, as time goes by, the soil horizons become more prominent and better developed. So here's an example of that. This is called a soil chronosequence. What we've got here are a bunch of beach sands, and the beach sands have been accumulating across this coastal plain over the last 4,000 years, such that soils over here are about 4,000 years old, and soils over here are about 400 years old. They're all formed in roughly the same type of beach sand. But have a look. The youngest profile essentially has no soil horizons. It has a little bit of iron oxide staining here, but otherwise it's just gray. In contrast, the 4,000-year-old profile 3, is starting to develop a pretty strong depositional B horizon and also a nice leached E horizon and a strong, thicker organic horizon. So as it turns out, geologists can exploit this soil chronosequence because if you don't know the age of these soils independently, you can actually make an estimate of the soil age just based on its degree of development. And we'll be practicing that in lab this week. So in summary, soils are a mixture of organic material and rock that is broken down by weathering processes. Never forget that soil horizons are formed by the in situ alteration of rocks and the addition of organic material. The ability to alter rock is essentially controlled by water and gas flow, and that in turn is controlled by soil texture or grain size. And that water and gas flow is also essential for governing plant life. On the macro scale, we can think about development of soil in terms of 5 environmental factors: climate, organic processes, relief, parent material, and time, which give us a whole variety of soils all across the world. If we hold the first 4 factors constant and we only vary time, then we may have what's called a soil chronosequence, in which we can use the development of the soil horizons to estimate the age of the soil. I'll leave you with these concept questions and see you in class. Thanks, everybody.